We're back in session in Department 1. Alters and alternates have returned. Mr. Durst is present. Mr. Chesnop, Mr. Miata, and his colleagues are present, and you may resume the playing of the recording, Mr. Miata.
Thank you, Your Honor. This is People's 174 that we're going to resume. The good news is that there's 1 hour and 30 minutes left.
Thank you.
Or bad news, whichever.
You would agree with your understanding that we were talking to Dateline. We're speaking to Dateline as Bob Durst's friend and not his lawyer, correct?
I was Bob Durst's lawyer and was not revealing any attorney-client.
So the statements that you made to Dateline, every one of them, and you, with your belief, would not have been confidential communications, correct? So do you remember telling Dateline, I want to play EA 409? This is from the June 19, 2015 Dateline episode. This is in response to a question about the investigation.
This would be People's 44.
And then we're going to...
Yes, you weren't. He did.
That's your wife, correct?
Yes.
You were sitting next to her during that interview, correct?
Right.
Do you recall her giving that response in your presence about Bob's response to
Yes, you weren't.
Excuse me,
He did.
giving that response.
Given that response, I'll repeat the question to her. You agree that you were sitting right next to your wife during that interview, correct?
Yes.
And that your wife was referring to Bob Durst's response to Kathy's reinvestigation, correct?
I think so.
And you agree that that was non-privileged communication, correct?
That information was given publicly at the trial. He stated that he was upset when they did the reinvestigation. It's one of the things that was part of his defense, and it was publicly stated on the record in the office of the trial.
It's 4:29 p.m. and we need to break until 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. Anything else before I adjourn?
Thanks for excusing me.
So the witness be admonished not to discuss
Yes.
his testimony with
Do not discuss your testimony with any other witness.
Yes.
And your order to return to this court tomorrow at 10 a.m. Anything else?
Thank you, Your Honor.
Department 81 is adjourned. So Mr. Altman is resuming the witness stand. He's got his attorney at his side, Mr. McLean. Ms. Bednarski is here also for him. Mr. Altman, I'll remind you that you're under oath and you may continue your examination.
Thanks, I saw it yesterday, and we went over a whole bunch of stuff. They wanted to talk about where I was, when and how, and everything. In Los Angeles, and I've been putting it off and putting it off. Just because I'm uncertain and uncomfortable trying to take a position, which I keep remembering things differently, sort of. So I never spoke to him at all about where I was, etc. in Los Angeles.
Right.
So,
That's it.
14 years ago, for God's sake.
Mr. Altman, you just heard that phone call, correct?
Yes.
You heard what Mr. Durst said on that phone call, is that correct?
Yes.
You heard him say in that phone call, I'm uncertain and uncomfortable trying to take a position, correct? You heard him say that?
Yes.
You heard him say that that was regarding whether, or strike that, about where he was in Los Angeles, correct? Mr. Altman, you heard Mr. Durst say, so I've never spoken to him about where I was, etc. in Los Angeles, correct?
Yes.
And isn't it correct that you did not hear Mr. Durst say to you whether I was in Los Angeles, correct?
I think you're taking it out of context. He said, I'm uncertain and uncomfortable. I'm remembering things differently, sort of.
Then he says, so I've never spoken to him about where I was, etc. in Los Angeles. That's what you heard him say, correct?
Correct.
Did you hear him say about whether I was in Los Angeles?
Didn't hear that.
What's that?
I didn't hear that.
Now I want to ask you, is this phone call affecting your testimony today in any way?
I'm just telling the truth. That's all I can do.
Can you answer my question, though, please?
I'm telling the truth. I'm not letting anything other than the truth affect my testimony.
So you're saying it's not affecting your testimony in any way?
I'm doing my best to be as truthful as I can.
Mr. Altman, can you tell me what phone calls have you reviewed? And by reviewed, I mean whether you've looked at it yourself, been shown, discussed. What phone calls have you reviewed prior to your testimony today?
This particular phone call was reviewed. I don't know where the other ones.
Well, can you tell me, did you review any other phone calls?
Yes.
How many approximately other phone calls did you review?
A few.
By a few, are we talking less than 5?
Yes.
Do you remember actually this call? Do you have a memory of this call that you had with Bob?
No.
And once you reviewed it, did you have a memory of this call?
I think it refreshes my recollection, but there's so many communications that I can't pin them down.
So when was the first time you reviewed this call?
Sunday.
Okay, thank you. I'll move on. Thank you, Robert. Did you know in advance that Bob was going to leave New York City? I'm talking about
No, the answer's no.
when he left, and I didn't characterize your phrasing properly, when he left after Douglas was named head of your organization.
No.
And how did you find out that he left New York City?
I had no communication from him. I didn't know he left New York City.
Were you aware that he had moved or was spending time in New Orleans and Dallas?
No.
When did you find out? And I'm talking about the period of time in 2000 and 2001. That's the time frame I'm talking about. Are you aware that during that period of time, Mr. Durst has testified in prior proceedings, and there has been public articles and commentary done that Mr. Durst was spending time in both Dallas and New Orleans? Are you aware of that from non-attorney client sources?
Yes.
Okay. When did you find out about that?
After the murder of, the death of, the death of Morris Black, I found out he was in Dallas, and that's when.
Did you also know that during that period of time he had also been in New Orleans?
No.
Did you know from public, non-privileged sources that Mr. Durst had been living in these places disguised as a woman?
Yes.
Did you know from non-privileged sources that Mr. Durst had been living in these places, and at least in one of them had been disguising himself as not only a woman, but a mute woman?
Yes.
When you heard that the first time from public sources, did that surprise you?
Yes.
Apart from any attorney-client conversation, did you ever ask Bob about that?
No.
You said you knew who Deborah Sheridan is, correct?
Yes.
How well do you know her?
I know it's good.
How long have you known her?
Oh, how long?
Yeah. again, from non-privileged sources, that Bob and Debbie were involved romantically?
I've read the newspapers.
Did you know in advance that they were getting married?
No,
So I assume you did not attend the wedding.
no, I didn't.
Over the years, have you and Emily, excuse me, spoken to the press on more than one occasion?
Yes,
You've spoken to Dateline, is that correct?
yes,
Have you spoken to 48 Hours?
yes,
Have you ever spoken to any print media?
yes,
Have you spoken to the New York Times?
yes,
Have you spoken to Charles Bagley?
yes.
The conversations that you had with Mr. Bagley, how many of them do you think you had?
I don't know.
Would you agree that they started back in 2001 approximately?
Yes,
And were those conversations, were they always done with your wife and Mr. Bagley, or did you have some separate conversations?
I believe she had separate conversations.
Did you ever have joint conversations with Mr. Bagley and your wife?
We had in-person conversations.
Did you also have any phone?
In person. In person.
Did you also have any phone conversations with Mr. Bagley?
I believe I did.
In these in-person conversations, was your wife sometimes there?
Yes,
In the phone conversations, was your wife sometimes on the phone?
no,
Were you aware that your wife was speaking to Mr. Bagley as well, separately from you?
yes,
And would you agree that there is nothing that you told Mr. Bagley that would be covered, you believe, by the attorney-client privilege?
if there was anything that I said to Mr. Bagley, it was off the record.
It was on, I'm sorry,
Off the record.
off.
It was confidential communication.
Let me back, wait a minute. Do you understand, Mr. Altman, that either a conversation is confidential and privileged and cannot be revealed? You understand that as a lawyer, correct?
Yes,
Do you believe there is an off-the-record exception that allows you to discuss a confidential communication of a client?
I didn't say I discussed confidential communications of a client. I said I spoken to Mr. Bagley with the understanding that he would not be printing anything he talked about.
I understand, but I want to go to a further issue. You agree, even though you had an off-the-record conversation with Mr. Bagley, you would never have told him anything that was a confidential communication from a client, correct?
I didn't have any confidential communication, no.
And specifically, you never told him any confidential communications that had come from Mr. Durst, is that correct?
Correct.
And you were aware of these articles at the time, correct?
That's a difficult question. I don't know what you mean.
Well,
The time before you wrote the article, I was aware of it?
no. What I'm asking is, so you or your wife talked to Mr. Bagley, and an article comes out in the New York Times. You're certainly aware of any articles that have come out involving you or your wife and Bob Durst.
After the printing of the article?
Yes. And as you sit here today, it is also your understanding, correct, that you directed your wife not to disclose any confidential communications either, correct?
I guess you could say that.
Well, I don't want you to guess. You testified yesterday, you had explained to your wife, I believe your statement was she had ongoing training by me regarding her responsibilities as a legal secretary for your firm, including her ethical responsibilities. Is that correct?
Yes, she was aware.
And in reviewing any of these newspaper articles, had there been anything even close to a confidential communication that had come from your wife, you would have immediately dealt with that situation, correct?
I don't recall any information that would call for that type of action.
Right, so what I'm basically saying, Mr. Altman, is you would agree that there is no confidential communication that you are aware of that has ever been told by either you or your wife to Mr. Bagley. Is that correct?
I don't know the answer to that question. I wasn't present during the conversations.
Well, you
I don't
also,
know. No, I don't know.
so you don't know if your wife disclosed confidential communications. Is that
I don't
correct?
know what she told me.
You're saying you and your wife have not talked about what she said to Mr. Bagley.
I didn't say that. I said I don't know what she told me. There's a difference.
Have you discussed what Emily Altman said to Charles Bagley since her testimony?
Discussed with whom?
No, I'm asking, have you discussed what Emily Altman previously said to Charles Bagley since Emily Altman's testimony?
No.
So you didn't, after she testified, you didn't ask her, Emily, what did you say to Charles Bagley?
No, I didn't.
Have you had conversations with Andrew Director Lawrence Merlin?
Ever in my life?
Yes.
When?
Yes. Have you ever, I'll start again, have you ever had conversations with Andrew Director Lawrence Merlin?
No. I only spoke with one of them.
Who did you speak with?
Right.
How many times have you spoken to each other?
Once.
Was your wife present?
No.
Was this by phone or in person?
Person.
Have you ever spoken to him by phone?
I've heard his voice on the phone. I didn't speak with him.
Are you
Yes,
aware?
the phone.
Are you aware that your wife has testified that she had conversations with Andrew Jarecki?
Yes.
Do you know what the contents of those conversations that she had with Andrew Jarecki are?
No.
And have you asked your wife about any questions with any statements she made to Mr. Jarecki since her testimony in conditional examination?
No.
You said that you had reviewed, you were aware of some of your wife's conditional examination testimony, correct?
Yes.
Are you aware that when your wife was originally asked if she had ever spoken to Bob Durst about where he was at the time of Susan Berman's murder, that she had answered no? Are you aware of that? That's what she testified to. You're not aware of that?
No, I didn't go over that position.
Are you aware that during her testimony, she was subsequently asked, did you ever tell Andrew Jarecki that Bob Durst had told you where he was at the time of Susan Berman's murder, and that she responded, I don't know? Are you aware of that?
No.
So you're saying that since your wife testified, you've not had a conversation with her about those specifics that I just mentioned?
Correct.
Well, when she called you on that Thursday morning, and you said that you had the conversation where you ended up telling her you're wrong, do you recall that?
Yes, it had nothing to do with Jarecki, no.
Sir, so you didn't discuss with her how it was her testimony came out. You only discussed what in fact she had testified to.
Yes.
Have you had discussions about Emily Altman's conditional examination testimony with any members of the defense?
No.
When you spoke to, and I'm not going to go through all the questions, I'm going to see if we can save some time here. Would you agree that when you spoke to Dateline in 48 hours, that again, just like with Mr. Bagley, you were not relating any confidential communications?
Correct.
Why did you speak to the New York Times, to Mr. Bagley originally?
My wife wanted me to.
When you spoke to Mr. Bagley, you said your wife asked you to do it, correct?
Yes.
You ever spoken to the newspaper about a client before the client's case was finished?
Yes.
Was it unusual for you to speak to the newspaper?
Yes.
When you spoke to the newspaper, to Mr. Bagley, would you agree that you were speaking as Bob Durst's close friend?
No.
Were you speaking as his lawyer?
Yes.
So you were speaking as his lawyer, but you were making sure that you were not disclosing anything confidential, is that correct?
Yes.
Would that be the same as when you were talking to Dateline in 48 Hours as well?
I guess you could compare it.
I'm sorry?
I guess you could compare it.
No, I'm saying, would that have been true, that when you were talking to Dateline, 48 Hours, and any other media person, that you were speaking to them not as Mr. Durst's friend, but as his lawyer?
No,
Okay? Can you tell me how it would be different?
because I did go on those shows and talked about my knowing Bob since we were young and giving background information about Bob, which has nothing to do with legal representation.
In answering the last question, you started to say, I did go on those programs as Bob's, and I heard what sounded like you using the word friend. That was the word you were about to say, wasn't it?
No.
You did not just a moment ago start to say the word friend and then catch yourself and change it. Okay. When you were speaking to Mr. Bagley, subsequent to that, did Bob Durst at any point tell you or comment on these articles that he had read?
Could you repeat the question again?
So after, let me go a different way on this. When you were speaking to any members of the media, and I'll start with Mr. Bagley, did you represent yourself as Bob's friend or as Bob's lawyer?
Lawyer.
So you told Charles Bagley during each interview you did with him that you were speaking to him as Bob's lawyer?
Mr. Bagley knew that I was Bob's lawyer. And I told him, I didn't tell him every minute I talked to him.
That's not what I asked you. What I
He
asked
said each every call.
you.
He said each and every call that you tell him.
When you had conversations with Mr. Bagley, and it's your testimony that you were not having them as Bob's friend, you were having these conversations as Bob's lawyer.
Yes.
Is that also true when you spoke to Dateline in 48 Hours?
No.
When you spoke to Dateline in 48 Hours, you were speaking to them as Bob's friend, is that correct?
I was really giving biographical information on this.
As Bob's friend, correct?
Yes.
When you spoke to Aaron Moriarty from 48 Hours in 2003 or 2004, did you and your wife in your presence, represent yourselves as close friends of Bob Durst, or as Bob Durst's lawyer and his secretary?
I couldn't separate the two. I was his lawyer and his friend.
That's not what I asked you. I'm asking you, do you recall, did you represent yourself to Aaron Moriarty for 48 Hours, you and your wife, did you represent yourselves as Bob's close friends or as his lawyer and his lawyer's secretary?
Both.
So it's your testimony that you told her in no uncertain terms, listen, I'm speaking to you not just as Bob's friend, but as his lawyer.
I told her I was his attorney and his friend. That's exactly what I said.
The interviews with 48 Hours in 2003 and 2004, those were done either at Bob's direction or with his knowledge, is that correct?
Bob knew that I was doing the show.
He knew you were doing the show in advance, correct?
Yes.
And did he in any way tell you, Stewart, you're not to go on that show?
No.
Did he tell you, Stewart, you're to tell Emily not to go on that show?
No.
Isn't it true that Bob Durst not only knew that you and Emily were going on TV in advance, but he encouraged you to do so in an effort to present information that he wanted disseminated to the media?
I can't tell you whether or not about what was in his mind, but he did want us to do the show.
What did he tell you? I'm asking. What did he say?
He asked us to do the show. He said he thought it would be a good idea.
Did he put any limitation when you did the show on what information you were to provide?
No, he doesn't. I'm not going to go into attorney-client privilege. I'm sure that is understood.
But this is important. I'm asking you. I'm not asking you what you decided to do. I'm asking you, did Bob Durst tell you, when you tell him, I'm going on the show, does he say to you, Stewart, if you're going on this show, I do not want you to discuss anything that is attorney-client privilege?
With the understanding that I wasn't revealing any attorney-client privilege, yes, he wanted me to do the show and go on the show and speak about his childhood, his growing up, and everything I could tell him.
Mr. Altman, I'm not asking you about the understanding. I'm asking you specifically. I'm going to ask the question again. Did Mr. Durst put any limit on what information you and your wife could convey when you went on the show? Okay. Did you understand my question?
I answered it.
What was the answer?
The answer was, I went on 48 hours and I told them what they wanted to know about Bob while retaining attorney-client privilege at the same time.
Okay, let me ask my question. My question is, did Mr. Durst put any limitation on you as to what you could say to 48 hours or daylight?
It was my understanding that I was not to disclose confidential information.
So again, my understanding, I'm going to ask it again. Did Mr. Durst himself put a limitation on you? Yes or no?
The way you were asking the question is did he tell me to go out there and tell them everything? No, he didn't tell me to go out there and tell them everything.
I'm going to say it again. No, that's not what I'm asking. I'm asking, did Mr. Durst specifically tell you, only tell them things that are not privileged?
He didn't specifically say that.
So you would agree, Mr. Altman, that when you spoke to Mr. Durst, he himself didn't put any limitation on what you could say to Dateline at 48 hours.
You can answer it. It's not determinative. You can answer.
Is that correct?
Correct.
Thank you. You are aware of the New York Rule of Professional Conduct 1.6, correct?
Yes.
That imposes a duty of confidentiality on an attorney and the attorney employees, correct?
Yes.
And you would agree that in this case, there was never a communication that you made that you are aware was in violation of that rule, is that correct?
Right.
And you are not aware, in this case, aware of any communication your wife Beverly made that is in violation of that rule, is that correct?
I'm not aware of it.
When you're saying you're not aware of it, as her supervisor, you're her supervisor, correct?
Correct.
She works for you, correct?
Correct.
In the office, I'm not saying who runs things at home, but in the office, you're in charge, correct?
Right.
So, Mr. Altman, when you say you're not aware, wouldn't you, sir, have absolutely discussed this issue with your employee when you discovered that she was speaking to the media about your client?
Which issue are you talking about?
Say again?
I don't know what issue you're talking about.
So, Mr. Altman, you are aware that your wife is speaking to Charles Bagg in the New York Times and you're not there, correct?
I agree, yes.
You're aware of that back when it starts in 2001 approximately, correct? Correct?
I'm trying to think of the answers.
Okay.
I'm around there, though.
And you're also aware that she spoke to Andrew Jarecki about Bob Durst when you were not around, correct?
Years later, I was there in 2001.
But I didn't ask what it was when you agree you're aware that she was talking to Andrew Jarecki years later about Bob Durst when you weren't around, correct?
Correct.
Do you know if Mr. Durst keeps track of his press clippings?
No, I don't know.
Haven't you had conversations while Mr. Durst has been in jail prior to September 2015 on recorded lines where he has asked you regarding articles that have been printed
Yes,
and to send them to him, correct?
yes,
Mr. Altman, wouldn't you concede that not only does Mr. Durst keep track of his press clippings, a better word would be he is obsessed by them?
what's your word?
What would your word be?
He wanted to see certain press clippings, and I sent him what I could.
In your experience, Mr. Altman, isn't it true that Mr. Durst wants to see every press clipping?
I guess so.
Mr. Altman, has Bob Durst said to you or Emily Altman that you are aware of on taped phone conversations from Pennsylvania or New Orleans jail prior to September of 2015 that he has seen you guys on television?
The answer is yes.
And during those conversations, Mr. Durst expressed happiness and or satisfaction with your performances.
It was, yes.
In fact, there have been calls during that time period to both you and your wife, which you're familiar with, where Mr. Durst expressed great pleasure with how the two of you had performed on Dateline in 48 Hours, correct?
Yes.
Are you aware of any phone call during that period of time where Mr. Durst said anything critical at all about you and Emily's performances on TV?
Not aware.
Are you aware of any phone call during that period of time where Mr. Durst said to either you or Emily anything to the effect of, I can't believe you said that, you're violating my privilege?
Not aware.
During those conversations, isn't it true that you and Emily both discussed statements Bob Durst had made to you?
I can't answer for what Emily said, and what I said, I believe is attorney-client privilege.
Now that's...
Okay, just a moment.
Listen to my question again. During your conversations with 48 Hours and Dateline, you have seen those episodes, correct?
Okay, yes.
During those episodes, isn't it true that both you and your wife have made statements that describe things that Bob Durst has said to you? Statements from Bob Durst.
To the recorded phone calls we just talked about?
Yes. Are you aware of any recorded conversation that you or Emily had with Bob Durst prior to September of 2015 where he said to either you or Emily, Stewart or Emily, I can't believe you violated my attorney-client privilege in speaking to Dateline in 48 Hours?
Not aware.
All right, we need to take a break for our reporter, and I think that would be a good time for our counsel to come back and chat with me just for a few minutes about our preliminary hearing proceeding. You remain under oath, you may continue your examination.
You spoke to Dateline in 2015 after Bob Durst had been arrested in Orleans, is that correct?
Yes.
And do you recognize this fellow here? I'm pointing to Robert Dean in the audience. Do you recognize Mr. Dean?
Yes, I do.
And was he a producer on that program?
Yes.
Did you have conversations with Mr. Dean?
Yes.
And are you aware that your wife had conversations with Mr. Dean?
Yes.
And those conversations included interviews or conversations you had, let's write that. You had conversations with Mr. Dean that were not shown on television, correct?
I don't know what was taped and what was not taped.
Oh, no, what I'm asking is that you saw the episode, correct?
Yes.
That episode was not the extent. That didn't show every conversation that you had with the folks from Dayline, correct?
I believe so.
And as far as you know, it didn't show every conversation that your wife had with Dayline, correct?
Correct.
Do you recall telling either Mr. Dean and or the correspondent during the interview, do you recall describing Bob's mental state at the time that Morris Black was killed and dismembered?
Yes,
Do you remember what you said?
yes.
What did you say?
I talked about him having gone into a fugue state. That's what you're referring to?
Yes, and can you tell me what, I'm going to show the clip, and I want you to tell me if this is exactly what you said. This is going to be clip EA 401, it's going to be people's 42 and 42A, Your Honor?
43 and 43A.
What's it? 43 and 43A. I relied on, I apologize, Robert, I relied on Mr. Mulius.
Not blaming Mr. Millius.
I won't do that again. My fault.
He said he went to a fugue state. It was an out-of-body experience. It's hard to understand.
That's you, correct?
That's me.
And that's you referring to the killing and dismemberment of Bob Durst. I mean, the killing and dismemberment of Morris Black, correct?
Yes.
And what did you mean by fugue state?
Well, it's a really psychological term, and I'm not that familiar with it, but it's a disassociative state that one goes into where they're acting out of their body experiences.
Was this information that you got specifically from Mr. Durst?
No. Actually, this information was public knowledge. This was part of the defense. This was said during the trial, the Morris Black trial, and it was public domain knowledge, and there was a doctor there too who spoke about it.
Are you aware that your wife told Dayline during the interview that we just showed you that Bob was trying to use everything within his power to look frail in front of the jury in Galveston?
Yes.
And you actually heard your wife speaking to Dayline and make that statement.
That's correct.
And is that information that you were aware of from Mr. Durst as well that was outside of the attorney-client relationship?
This is outside the attorney-client. In my opinion, things I learned from Bob are attorney-client.
Well, so here's my question. Emily Altman is your representative, is that correct?
Emily Altman is my wife.
Well, yes.
I call her my representative.
Is she your employee in your law practice?
Yes.
Or have you been arguing that she's entitled to a privilege as your agent?
In relation to my law practice? Yes.
So my question is, when Emily Altman was telling Dayline in your presence that Bob was trying to use every way within his power to look frail when he was on trial in Galveston, would you agree, sir, that that was not a confidential communication that she was repeating?
I don't know where she got that information from. I really don't.
Well, Mr. Altman, you would agree that really the only reasonable inference from that statement is that she got it from Bob Durst or from somebody on the legal team. Would you agree?
No, I think she possibly could have surmised this on her own. Maybe she watched Bob and saw him deteriorating over the months.
No, her point was not that Bob was deteriorating. She said Bob was trying to use every way within his power to look frail when he was on trial at Galveston.
That's what she said.
So my question is it your position that that was not a confidential communication she was repeating?
She wasn't speaking as my agent at that time, she was talking on her own.
So she was speaking as Bob's friend, is that correct?
I don't know.
Well, Mr. Altman, if she's discussing the intention of your client to deceive a jury,
That's not what she said.
Mr. Altman, how would you interpret Bob was trying to use every way within his power to look frail when he was on trial in Galveston? How would you interpret that statement?
I don't think that would be to deceive the jury. I would think it would just be a strategy in trial.
All right, it's 12 o'clock. We're going to resume at 1:30. The order to return to this court at 1:30. Do not discuss your testimony with any other witness. We'll resume at that time. Thank you.
Your Honor, could Mr. Lewin and I visit you for 1 minute before you release the jury?
Before I release the jury,
Yeah,
yes, you
thank
can
you.
visit me for 1 minute before I...
Yes. And for the record, I paused the video at 3 hours, 7 minutes, 30 seconds.
Ladies and gentlemen, we'll go for our amendment. So do not converse among yourselves or with anyone else on any subject connected with this case. Do not form or express any opinion on the case. We'll see you another time. Have a good evening.